talk about reauthorization of flood insurance, a lot of people start talking about this from the standpoint of mitigating these risks. And first of all, water is a resource. You know, the tendency is when it's a lot of water, we don't like it. But water is a resource, and it has value. And how we manage it should be something that those shareholders see as adding value to their communities. But if you don't get to this first point, that we're trying to run an insurance company where we as a nation are trying to make decisions about where you as a taxpayer, where you as a shareholder should invest in subsidizing risk. Because if we weren't subsidizing risk and you were paying actual market value for this threat, the commercial industry would ride it. Right? So you, in effect, we as a country, are making decisions about how we manage risk. Now, we've got a lot of folks, they were there before these programs ever came about. And there is, I think, a certain degree of responsibility that I have to find a way to make sure that we minimize and gradually bring them into these programs without getting the shock of suddenly finding themselves having to add a couple $100 a month to their escrow that they weren't planning for because they now have a mandatory purchase requirement that nobody had ever given them any indication was until we had better map data. But certainly, new growth, new development, federal dollars, whether it's highway, whether it's investments where we're buying lands or we're investing in other parts of the environment, needs to be tailored back to this idea that we're not going to walk away from managing this risk. We're not going to walk away from subsidizing this risk. But we need to make investment strategies that are sustainable because in the ideal world, we move away from all of these programs that are dealing with all these adverse effects, as you point out here, of trying to bring the federal family together so we're all working as a team versus sometimes having programs that are diametrically opposed to each other. And look at how do we manage risk from an investment strategy that goes beyond just a home, a business, a community, society, the environment we live in. That's going to take more and more, I think, taking a step back from this and looking at this not from individual pieces of the programs, individual program areas, individual concerns or constituencies, but looking at this from the total picture of water is a resource. And we have to learn how to look at that resource and live with that resource, understanding that sometimes there's not enough and sometimes there's way too much, but it's still a resource. It has a value. And from the flood insurance perspective, making investment strategies and building a system that encourages people to be a good steward of that resource, not just looking at a single phase of that resource when we have too much in a flood, but how do we manage it from the standpoint of the entire life cycle of our hydrology systems, understanding that oftentimes our best solution was nature in the first place. But the more we constrict, the more we try to move away from that to more active systems. As Ed will tell you, the reason we have so much fun down in South Florida is we built flood control structures to prevent flooding. Then we put 6 million people down there and decided, oh, these would make really good water storage devices. Now, Lake Okeechobee was never built to be a water storage device. It was built to protect against flooding. But with the demands on the systems down there, our hydrology cycle now demands that our systems do two distinct functions which sometimes are not compatible. Store lots of water for a population that cannot make it through the dry season, but 2, use a storage facility that was never designed for that and was responsible for one of the largest catastrophes in my home state, with over 2,000 people drowned when that lake sloshed out and killed everybody. And those populations have increased. So the last thing, probabilities are a fun way to talk about risk. All right? You generally trigger the purchase requirement for flood insurance if you have a 1% annum of having a flood event, whether it's rainfall or something else causing it, storm surge, you name it. That triggers you have to buy flood insurance. The general public feels that that is unfair because they've lived here all this time and they have never had a flood. Yet many of these same people will go out and buy lottery tickets every week, expecting to win. The little state of Rhode Island, recent floods, a little factoid. In the last 10 years, what has occurred most recently will be the biggest payout of all the floods that state has experienced for the last 10 years in one event. State of Tennessee. Tennessee was a lot worse than a lot of people realize because it was a good response, a lot of volunteers, local governments doing their thing right. And so it didn't look like it was that bad because the response went very successfully. That disaster, as of earlier this week, had over 40,000 people who have registered for FEMA assistance. We're over $100 million right now in individual assistance, and we're still processing. Ed likes to challenge us and give us, from the Corps' perspective and from our perspective, how do we change this outcome? How do we move to where you don't need a national flood insurance program anymore because we have learned how to manage our hazards in a way that don't require a subsidized risk-based program, but has moved to we now live and build and engineer in our environment in such a way that the commercial industry can actually sell flood insurance and make money at it because the risk is manageable and not requiring you as a shareholder to subsidize it. That is about as far out as I can go with this program. But if you put us out of business because it's no longer needed, then that's an outcome that starts driving a lot of discussions because you cannot get there without making sure we have taken advantage to protect our environment, that we have built our infrastructure to withstand these hazards, and we don't put people knowingly into high hazard areas without them making an informed decision and be given the tools to build in such a way that they can minimize their future losses. So put us out of business. You're the floodplain managers. Manage the hazard. Flooding shouldn't be a disaster. Thank you.